There's a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being yourself and still being misunderstood. You stay quiet, not because you're angry, but because noise exhausts you. You leave early, not to be rude, but because your social battery runs out faster than others. You choose peace, and yet, somehow, they call you cold. And maybe the worst part isn't that they don't get you. It's that you start questioning whether something's wrong with how you are. You begin to wonder, is it my fault for needing space? For not wanting small talk? You weren't trying to be distant. You were trying to breathe. But in a world that equates silence with rejection, is there still room for those who speak more with their presence than their words? Let's begin with why so many people still believe that being quiet must mean something is broken. To understand why quietness is so often mistaken for coldness, we have to step into the world that raised those who misunderstand it. For generations, warmth wasn't measured by how safe you felt in silence. It was measured by how quickly you smiled back, how easily you joined a conversation, how well you fit in. In families, in workplaces, in neighborhoods, being likable was often linked to being loud enough to be noticed. Being social meant you were trustworthy, friendly, even successful. People who kept to themselves were often seen as hiding something, and silence was interpreted not as comfort, but as suspicion. "No man is an island," John Donne famously wrote. And this belief shaped the social culture of millions who came before us. Especially in collectivist settings in tight-knit towns, multi-generational households, or faith-based communities, being quiet wasn't neutral. It was considered withholding. Why wouldn't you speak up? Why wouldn't you join the group? Why wouldn't you laugh a little louder just to show you care? To older generations, being reserved felt like a refusal to engage, a kind of passive rebellion. Not outright disrespect, but enough to raise eyebrows. And so when someone like you walks into a room and chooses to sit at the edge, say little, and leave early, they don't read it as peace. They read it as rejection. Your silence tells them, "I don't want to be here," even when you're silently whispering, "I just need to rest." And they respond with concern, judgment, or distance, not always out of malice, but out of misinterpretation. A parent says, "Why are you so cold to your cousins?" A coworker remarks, "You're always so quiet. Are you upset with someone?" A friend asks, half joking, "Are you mad at me, or is that just your face?" They try to pull you out of your quietness, believing they're helping. But what they're actually doing is projecting their discomfort with stillness onto you. Because in their world, being emotionally available meant being emotionally visible. And if they can't see you, your smiles, your warmth, your conversation, then maybe they fear you're just not there at all. It's not entirely their fault. Many of them never had the language to express emotional boundaries or to understand introversion. To them, retreat meant withdrawal, and withdrawal meant something was wrong. They never learned that silence could be sacred, that not all love is loud. So what happens next? You start to perform. You laugh louder than you feel. You stay longer than you want. You nod along to things you don't agree with. Not because you've changed, but because being misunderstood feels heavier than pretending. And eventually, the person who once craved peace becomes the person who fears being seen as cold. So they talk more, force smiles, stay polite, all the while feeling more disconnected from themselves. This is the trap of being human in a world that prizes extroversion as evidence of goodness. We live in a society that rewards loud personalities, writes Susan Cain in Quiet, but undervalues the quiet ones who think deeply, listen closely, and move gently. If you've ever been told that you're too distant, too closed off, too serious, you're not alone. That judgment doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from people who simply equate noise with warmth and silence with absence. But here's the real question, and it brings us to what happens inside you. What does it do to someone when their peace, their most natural way of being, is labeled as a flaw? Let's go there now. Because what the world sees as cold is often someone quietly fighting to stay true to themselves. It's strange how something that feels so natural to you can feel so foreign to everyone else. You're not avoiding people. You're not angry. You're not trying to be mysterious or aloof. You're just being. There's a kind of peace in not having to explain yourself all the time, in being able to sit in silence without filling it. But somewhere along the way, that silence got rewritten not by you, but by how others interpreted it. And now, even when you're comfortable in your quietness, a part of you is always on edge, waiting for the misunderstanding to land. You look mad. Why are you being weird? You're always so distant. And each time it happens, a little voice in your head wonders, am I too much or not enough? The truth is, many of us grew up being told that we were too quiet, that we should speak up more, be friendlier, smile more. It wasn't always said with cruelty, but it left a mark. You start to believe that your natural way of existing isn't just different, it's defective. So you try to fix it. You push yourself to go to parties you don't enjoy. You rehearse conversations in your head to seem more normal. You answer messages quickly so no one thinks you're rude. You stay longer than you want, laugh louder than you feel, perform a version of connection that isn't fully you. All because silence has become suspicious, and being misunderstood feels worse than being exhausted. But here's the thing no one tells you. Not all stillness is sadness. Not all silence is distance. Not all solitude is loneliness. Sometimes it's just space. The space you need to process, to rest, to be. You feel deeply. You notice more than you say, and you speak when it matters. But the world keeps mistaking your quietness for disconnection. And after a while, it gets hard not to internalize it. You begin editing yourself, even in safe spaces. You stay quiet not because you want to, but because you're afraid that if you speak the truth of your experience, it will be dismissed. You think, if I tell them I just need quiet, will they think I'm avoiding them? You carry that tension silently, the weight of always having to prove that your peace doesn't mean absence, that your quiet doesn't mean cold, that your silence isn't a wall, it's just a pause. There's a quote by Brené Brown that says, "Belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are." And yet, for quiet people, being who we are often comes with a price. We are seen as distant when we are just self-contained. We are labeled as cold when we are simply conserving warmth. But the deeper pain isn't in the mislabeling. It's in the slow erosion of your sense of safety. Because the more you're misunderstood, the more you question whether it's safe to show up as yourself. And eventually, you start wondering, is it worth it? Is it worth being true to your nature if it means being misread, misjudged, and mischaracterized over and over again? But maybe the real courage isn't in changing to fit the narrative. Maybe it's in quietly reclaiming your own, in reminding yourself that your peace is not a problem, your quietness is not a flaw, and your presence, even when it still is enough. Still, It's not easy. Because at some point, you realize being yourself doesn't guarantee being understood. So how do we live in a world that mistranslates silence and still stay true to ourselves? Let's talk about that. The older you get, the more you realize being yourself doesn't guarantee being understood. But it doesn't mean you have to become someone else. The challenge is this: to live in a world that mistranslates silence and still protect the part of you that values quiet. To stay soft, even when you're called cold. To stay still, even when noise is mistaken for connection. Because here's the truth, most people learn the hard way. You don't need to be loud to be present. You don't need to be constantly available to be kind. You don't need to entertain to belong. But it helps to translate your quietness not into noise, but into clarity. Let people know, I'm someone who recharges in silence. I care, I just show it differently. You don't owe long explanations. But a little self-definition can be a bridge between your peace and their perception. There's a difference between shrinking and standing still, between shutting down and simply taking a breath. In fact, there's a quiet kind of leadership that comes from people who don't fill every silence with words, but who make others feel safe in that silence. The quieter you become, the more you are able to hear. By Rumi. That includes hearing yourself. When you stop trying to prove that your peace isn't a problem, you begin to move differently, not with fear, but with intention, not with urgency, but with steadiness. You start to make choices that protect your energy. You listen to your body when it says, I've had enough. You learn that saying no doesn't make you selfish, it makes you honest. You begin to show up, not everywhere, but where you're meant to be. And you stop apologizing for needing space. Because here's the thing, some people will always misread you. No matter how kind you are, how open you try to be, how gently you show up, some will still say, you're too quiet, or you're distant. That's okay. Not everyone will get the language of stillness. But that doesn't mean you need to speak louder. It means you need to stand firmer in yourself. The more you understand your own rhythm, the less you feel the need to match others. You find your people the ones who don't need constant noise to feel close. The ones who sit with you in silence and still feel connected. And you learn that presence is not about how much space you take up, but how much truth you bring with you, even in stillness. So, if you've been called cold because you're quiet, don't carry that label as truth. Carry it as a mirror, one that reflects more about others' expectations than about your essence. You're not here to be loud enough for them to notice. You're here to be true enough to recognize yourself even when no one else does. In order to understand the world, wrote Albert Camus, one has to turn away from it on occasion. That's not selfish. That's survival. That's strength. That's knowing that silence isn't the absence of connection, it's the presence of self. Still, it's not always easy to explain that to others, especially to those who come from a different time, a different emotional language. So what happens when your parents, your elders, or your coworkers don't understand your quietness? Let's look at that. For many older generations, silence has always carried meaning, and usually not a comforting one. They grew up in homes where being quiet meant something was wrong. A child who stopped speaking was assumed to be upset. A partner who stayed silent during dinner must have been holding back resentment. Silence wasn't seen as peace. It was read as a signal of danger, disapproval, or emotional distance. So when someone they care about becomes quiet, even for reasons of self-care, it doesn't land as neutral. it lands as rejection. To them, love is visible. Love is audible. You show you care by showing up, by talking, by asking, by doing. So when a son comes home and sits quietly in his room, the parents don't think he's decompressing. They think he's pulling away from us. When a daughter skips small talk at the dinner table, they don't assume comfort. They worry something's wrong or worse, that they've done something wrong. They don't always say it aloud, but their discomfort turns into distance. Their confusion turns into criticism. Why are you always in your own world? You used to be so warm. What happened to you? They don't ask to hurt. They ask because they care, but they don't know how else to show it. It's not that they don't accept who you are. It's that they fear they're losing the version of you they once understood. And maybe that's the real invitation here. Not to argue who's right or wrong, but to begin building a bridge between their love language and yours. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to feel seen, even if we speak in different volumes. So how do we hold on to our quiet without losing connection? Let's close with that. You don't need to explain your silence to everyone, but you also don't have to carry the weight of being misunderstood alone. Being quiet doesn't mean you're disconnected. Being still doesn't mean you're cold. It means you're human navigating a noisy world in the way that protects your spirit. It's okay to crave peace. It's okay to choose stillness over noise, depth over display, presence over performance. And yes, it's okay to want connection, even when you're not the loudest person in the room. Because real connection doesn't come from volume. It comes from truth. And when you show up as your true self, quietly, gently, consistently, the right people will hear you, even when you say nothing. So, if you've ever felt like your silence was a flaw, let this be your reminder. You're not broken. You're just built for something deeper. Don't raise your voice. Improve your argument, Desmond Tutu once said. But maybe, for people like us, it's not even about the argument, it's about the clarity we carry within. Thank you for spending these quiet few minutes with me. If this video helped you feel seen, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you know someone who's ever been misunderstood for being quiet, feel free to share this with them. In an upcoming video, we'll explore a sentence that sounds kind, but can actually leave a scar. You might have heard it before, but have you truly unpacked what it means? Until then, thank you for being here exactly as you are. Quiet, gentle, and real.